Okay.
So I'll wait until I see exactly 10 o'clock before I say anything.
Okay.
What says we're on live now?
Okay. Well, we'll be official at exactly 10 o'clock. So we're going to wait 1 minute for other folks to jump on here. It's good to see everybody.
Nice seeing you too. It's good to be seen.
Okay, guys, I think I'm looking to see who do we have on here. We've got 10. I think we're gonna have a pretty good attendance here. Okay, we got Senator Gallion on here. We'll wait 1 more minute. Okay. Okay, guys, we'll just get started. It's 10 o'clock, and I'll just brief comment. There's been a lot written recently about the blueprint, not just funding, but also I think questions have arisen even within our group, within the committee, about governance, structure, accountability, the interplay between implementation board and the state superintendent, and all these issues. And then there are also some budget issues as well. But I think we've made a decision, I say a decision. I think that the budget issues are a bit more complicated and do involve the Budget and Tax Committee. So I think what we were going to do today would be limited to implementation board. Yep. I'm getting a little back, somebody else. And then there are also some budget issues as well. But do you hear you hear some kind of back? Okay. Somebody. I think the budget issues are a bit more complicated and Okay, somebody resolved the problem. So I think the budget issues, involves the Budget and Taxation Committee. And so I think what we're contemplating here is, today we'll talk more about governance, accountability, structure, some of those issues. And then we're going to work with B&T, I think, to talk about the budget issues, shortfalls, how it plays into our budget deficits, hopefully in a joint briefing that specifically we can get some the budget experts from DLS in to collaborate with with our B&T folks for that. Okay, so I hope that makes sense, as opposed to rolling the budget issues into the governance issues. I think could complicate things a bit, and I think B&T is interested in doing that, so we're going to work on that. Mary, and I'll give Senator Washington a little credit. She really, I think, sort of emphasized, along with Senator Carrozza and others, that it was important to and timely and topical for us to get a conversation going about the blueprint and that type of thing. So, Stacy, why don't I yield to you? Mary, did you want to? Mary, Senator Washington, our Education Subcommittee Chair, did you want to add anything before we yield over to Stacy?
Thank you, Chair. You covered everything. We're looking this as an opportunity. We have so much to think about this year and on an ongoing basis, just to have this K through 12 governance 101 so that we really understand the structures and the institutions and the laws that have been passed over the last few years. So thank everyone for using some of your summertime, and we'll turn it over.
Okay, Stacy, why don't you take it from here? And again, we'll do something on the budget issues in a separate Zoom similar to this, probably jointly with B&T. So okay, so Stacy, again, I'll let you get going here.
All right. Good morning. Again, my name is Stacy Goodman. I'm with the Department of Legislative Services and counsel with this committee, Education, Energy, and the Environment. So I'm going to share my screen here because we are going to get started on this presentation, which will be an overview of the governing units here in the Maryland elementary and secondary education system. We won't be touching on higher education today. We're only going to be talking about decisional units with decisional authority within the K-12 or pre-K-12 structure. So just a little snapshot here of who it is that the K-12 structure is serving. In Maryland, we have 24 local school systems. That includes 23 counties and Baltimore City, which is considered a county under state law for purposes of the education law. There are 1,421 public schools in the state, and they are distributed obviously throughout those 24 local school systems, and it includes a few state schools, the School for the Deaf, School for the Blind, and the Seed School. There are almost 890,000 public school students in the state, and we have quite demographic diversity throughout the state. Our last census showed that there is 33% white students, 33% Black students, about 22% Hispanic students, about 5 to 7% Asian students, and then a remainder of mixed race students. So we have quite diversity throughout all of our 24 local school systems, which is probably more than a higher average than other states do. We have 62,000 teachers and 3,500 principals and assistant principals. All told, we have about 130,000 full-time employees within our entire school system. So it's a massive structure here in this state, and these are all public employees, and this governing structure serves these people. This is what we do. So with that, we'll just say the Constitution of Maryland in Article 8, Section 1, requires the General Assembly, not the governor, but the General Assembly, to establish throughout the state a thorough and efficient system of free public schools. And to do that, the General Assembly has established essentially this structure. And it looks like a lot, but I'm going to walk through it real quickly here. At the head of this kind of matrix is the State Board of Education. And the State Board of Education is the head of Maryland Public Schools. And then as you'll see that it says at the bottom that there's only a couple direct lines of authority unbroken. That's the State Superintendent of Schools, who is an employee of the State Board of Education and who is the administrator of the State Department of Education, which has a pretty broad authority when it comes to education in this state. You also see on this matrix, next to the State Board of Education is the Professional Standards and Teacher Education Board. So their decisional authority is concurrent jurisdiction with the State Board on establishing standards for teacher education and other personnel. We'll also talk about them on a slide a little bit later. You'll also see something a little different here, the Public School Labor Relations Board. If you recall, the General Assembly passed legislation last year to this board will be no longer in existence. It's rolling all of these collective bargaining type boards into one single board. So this board will go away. Also of note here, next, if you go on the left side of the slide where it says the Interagency Commission on School Construction, the General Assembly also passed legislation this past year, which will make this an independent agency. It's no longer going to be housed within the Department of Education. So that will be discussed in today's presentation as an independent authority versus as part of the Department of Education. Moving to the local structure, you'll also notice that the lines aren't directly and solid. The local boards of education, we'll be talking about them and their local and superintendents of schools. They are what they consider quasi-state agencies or independent authorities. They're not directly within the state government structure, and they're not within the county government structure, even though they are considered state for some purposes and county for others. So that's just to give you an overview of what's here. What's not going to be discussed today would be, for example, the Maryland Longitudinal Data System Center, because even though it has an important function, it doesn't really have any decisional authority within this structure. Similarly, the OIG for Education, they're more fraud, waste, abuse. They're not really decisional authority when it comes to setting policies or whatnot. So we're not going to talk about them today. So we'll start with the head of the beast
Hey,
here. as the state-
Stacy, can I just interrupt? If we, as we go through this, if you have a question, I don't think we necessarily have to wait till the very end and go back, so as we go through this, if somebody has a question, just, unmute yourself and we'll just do it that way. Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Sounds good. Okay, so when constructing this presentation, it was asked that we talk about where the money comes from. So we're not going to talk about how much, because figures can overwhelm sometimes. We're going to talk about where each of these entities gets their funding from and where they get their authority from, as well as what their roles and responsibilities in the system are overall. So on this slide, we're going to talk about the State Board of Education. It's a 13-member board. It includes one student member. Previous to a few years ago, there was no essential qualifications on this board other than, for example, a consideration of diversity in geography and other demographics. However, in the recent years, the thinking has changed on these types of governing boards, where they're looking for particular perspectives and points of view and experience and skills from members. And so the General Assembly added one actively teaching certified teacher to the board, and that member has been there for either a term, almost a whole term, and also included a parent with a student enrolled in a public school. So those are fairly newer members of the board, but they have been successful so far. Each of these members is appointed by the governor with the advice and consent of the Senate. So each of you has voted for confirmation of the people who are currently sit on this board. The student member is selected slightly differently. The certified teacher first goes through an election of teachers in the state, and then they're nominated to the governor, and the governor makes the selection. And the same with the parent. They get selected by PTAs, and then they send a list up to the governor, and the governor makes a selection. They serve staggered 4-year terms. The student member only serves 1-year term, as it's generally an 11th or 12th grade student. They are limited to 2 consecutive 4-year terms. You can note that sometimes that means that a person might come in to fill a vacancy. They can continue to serve for 2 additional terms. The State Board of Education is funded by state general funds. So there's a budget for the Department of Education, and theirs comes from the Office of the State Superintendent. The way that's coded in the budget, you'll see the budget code is there. The State Board of Education is established through state law. That's in Title II, Subtitle 2. That's the reference right there. So what does the State Board of Education do? Its role in the system is to govern. It sets basic policy parameters. It kind of takes the direction. What is education? What do we need in the state of Maryland in terms of education, and where should it go? How do we get there? So in deference to this, these are the types of activities that a state board does. It assesses, as I said, what's the direction for education in the state of Maryland. Do we need more schools? Do we need, what kind of resources do we need to get there? And it prepares an annual state public school budget. The superintendent starts with that and brings it to the state board, and they discuss what resources will be needed throughout the state. It adopts the bylaws, rules, and regulations for the administration of public schools, health policy. It sets the standards for what students need to learn and to know, the skills. So as they say, the curriculum is how you get the information, but standards are what you need to know. So this is what their role is to say, for example, in social studies, these are the topics that will need to be included. These are the information that needs to be gained. These are the skills they need to be able to understand trends across a certain period of time and make connections. So that would be a function of the state board, is to set those standards. I think Senator Feldman, are you saying?
I do
something?
see I see Senator Hester has her hand raised. So why don't we go to you, Katie?
Thank you, Stacy. I really appreciate this overview excuse me. So every year we have, a bunch of bills that seek to influence curriculum. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on what would be the process with the State Board of Education if you actually wanted to change the standard? Is there like a formal process for doing that?
I don't think there is a formal process for reconsideration or review of the curriculum standards every certain number of years. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it's like every 7 to 10 years they take a look at the standards. So for example, if the Maryland General Assembly passed a bill on curriculum, then they would obviously have to go in and there would be a process by which they would have to literature review, and they would do a stakeholder engagement, and they would have to do research to understand exactly what there might be best practices in teaching that particular topic or that subject. And then they would have to draft a committee to go through and decide exactly what the skills and knowledge in that particular content area is. And then it would be brought to the state board, and the state board would have to review that and adopt that as part of the Maryland curriculum standards.
Okay, I think I'd love a little more information on that. We can take it offline.
Okay.
Yeah, I see Senator Washington, Lewis Young, and then Carozza. So why don't we go in that order? Senator Washington, why don't you go first?
Thank you. Again, thank you so much for this, Stacy. And the references are really helpful. I think I have two questions. One is, I guess, a sort of a follow-up on Senator Hester's. What is there a scenario in which, or what is there's the process by which, say, the board decided to look at regulation? And in other words, can curriculum standards be set by regulation?
Yes, they are. They are in regulation, so
Right.
they have adopted them. Yes, you can find them in regulation.
So some of it is we get a lot of laws for proposed laws and changes, but these could be done in regulation through the board.
Well, I mean, it's the authority of the board to set those particular standards. So that's generally the process by which they do it.
Right. And then I wanted to better understand the budget portion. So the state board approves the budget, or do they have a budget committee, or how do they evaluate the budget just from a structural perspective?
Well, this is, again, they're approving the budget and they present it to the governor. This is for costs for operation of the State Department of Education and things like that. So the superintendent, the state superintendent would be the one essentially to make the preparations with the appropriate people in the budget, and then brings it to the state board, presents it to the state board, and they decide to adopt it from there. So I mean, it's though it's their responsibility under state law, it's generally the state superintendent who is within the department that's going to be presenting them with a recommendation and options.
So it's for the funding of the department, not for school, not the funding of the system.
Correct. Right.
Okay. All right, thank you.
That is only for the operation of the department.
Okay. And then I guess one other around and we could find out where the, I guess, review of expenditures or allocations, would that come under the school board, as it's related to the Department of Education?
I'm not exactly sure on that, so I can find out.
So it's just a question. What's their process, or if they have an internal structure for that? Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Karen, you're up next, and then we'll go to Mary Beth Carozza next.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I'd certainly like to share it with our local Board of Education.
Hey, Karen, can I just interject? So we are recording this, so
sure.
Anybody who wants to watch any of this later, you'll be able to, direct them to the recording of this session. Okay, so back to you. Yeah,
great. It will provide much clarity. So my question is, does the student member of this board have voting rights? And if so, are there any restrictions on those voting rights?
Yes, the student member does have voting rights on this board, but they can't vote on everything. There are restrictions. I don't have them in front of me, but they're definitely restrictions and they're put in the law.
Thanks very much.
Okay, Senator Carozza?
Good morning, Mr. Chair and colleagues. I want to thank you for holding this briefing, both the chair and Senator Washington. I've been spending some one-on-one time with my individual superintendents, the 3 counties that I represent. And so this is very timely. And just to let you know, they're planning, I'm planning to meet with them in more detail on where they are with implementation. But one question that has come up, and that's, I wanted to raise the question here, when you have the, the description here of the role of the State Board of Education, I guess I was trying to figure out how is that relationship, the State Board of Education relationship with the local education authorities, how is that defined? And because that's, I think that's some clarity on that would be helpful, especially in light of the role of the AIB board, the role of the State Board of Education, and the interaction with the local public school systems as they're moving forward with their implementation plan. So I think defining that would be helpful.
Well, I think in terms of whether the state board itself does these interactions, it's mostly the state superintendent who is the employee of the state board that's going to be interacting with the locals. I mean, because it's very hard in general for boards to kind of communicate and with boards. So the superintendents of these school systems, of this board, these are employees of the board, and they will do most of the communication probably with the other superintendents. And then the superintendents go back to their boards and they work on their issues as they were. We're going to get a little bit to the AIB later. So if you want to talk about how the AIB and the state board interact and the department works, we can go back and talk about that at that time.
But before going to the AIB, I believe there should be some clarification. And if your response is that the interaction is primarily with the state superintendent and the local superintendents, that may need to be clarified. And 2, I think there is the lack of clarity has resulted in some local boards sometimes not knowing, are they going to their state board? Are they going to their superintendent? So, I think that some clarity would actually be helpful at both the local and the state level.
Well, I'm not sure. Are you talking about me clarifying, or are you talking about the law clarifying?
I think that this committee, and I'm looking at Senator Washington and Chair Feldman, that I think that some clarity on the roles, and these are pretty vague. So some clarity might be helpful. So when we come to these challenging issues that we're going to have on implementation of Kerwin, we understand the roles and the responsibilities both at the state and local level. And I really believe it would improve just an understanding, especially as we're moving forward in an area that we've never, worked on with the reform.
If I might say, Senator Carozza, this is precisely, and then why I was interested in this comprehensive, we're not going to discuss specific policy, although I took the note of your observation, but for us to really know what we're talking about, what the structures are, what the relationships are in code and regulation, and then certainly the education subcommittee and the committee as a whole, we can discuss our observations and if there are some clarifications needed. But you're precisely right that it would be good for us to understand for ourselves. So taking the time to hear how it is now, and then we can continue the conversations about what we think might need to change or what fits well or some clarifications. But be assured that that's the purpose, the underlying purpose of this.
And the only thing I'd add is that's why we're doing this in July and not in January. Okay. I mean, there's a reason we're doing it in the summer to, talk about some of these very topics. So, okay. Any other questions before we move on back to Stacy? Okay. I think we're good. Stacy, back to you.
Okay. Well, I think basically people have time to read through the slide, but you just note, I mean, some of the bigger things is what the state board does. Their guidance setting, policy setting, governance overarching structure. One of the other important things they do is they establish the regulations for the graduation standards of students, high school graduation standard. These come from and adopted by the state board, and locals do have the option to add a couple things, but for the most part, graduation standards are set at this particular level. So this one is, again, just an idea of what the straight lines were, except for the Professional Standards Board, which is, again, the concurrent authority in that one particular niche area. But as it is, this shows that the state board is the head. The state superintendent of schools is the employee of the State Board of Education, and the state superintendent is the administrator of the State Department of Education, but they're all part of the same structure. So the Professional Standards and Teacher Education Board, or PSTEB, or PSTEB, as some people say, here is a 24-member board. I think they're a little bit hidden. A lot of people aren't aware that they exist or what they do. There are 24 members, plus the state superintendent or their designee. It's basically composed of teachers and administrators. Here it's 8 public school teachers and 1 non-public school teacher, 6 education faculty from state institutions of higher education in the state. They are teacher preparation programs are housed at these institutions. So they're representative on here to get an idea of what types of things so they can work together to produce the best teachers. We have 4 public school administrative or supervisory staff and 1 non-public school administrator or supervisory staff. Also represented is the 1 member of a county board of education and a member of the Maryland Association of Non-Public Special Education Facilities, plus 2 representatives of the general public. Again, this board is appointed by the governor with the advice and consent of the Senate, and they serve staggered 3-year terms. They are also a creature of state law created in Title VI, Subtitle 7. And we've reached out to find out where they get their funding, but essentially their expenses, they're not paid members. So this is just budgeted with state funds in the normal state education budget. So what do? They basically have concurrent jurisdiction with the state board, meaning that both of them have to agree to adoption of regulations regarding licensure and standards for teachers and professionals, other education professionals and personnel in the state. They set requirements for preparation of teachers, the certification of social workers, and attracting and providing certification to teachers from groups historically underrepresented in the teaching profession. I believe that was language that was added by the blueprint. So you may recall that as Senator Washington is head of one of the co-chairs of the ALR committee, that the state board has just proposed some regulations regarding the licensure of teachers. They have decided to make some changes. Instead of certification, they would like to change the nomenclature to licensure.
Okay, I see Senator Carrozza, Stacey has a question. Senator Carrozza, why don't you go to it?
Thank you. 2 brief questions. One, would the makeup of this Professional Standards and Teacher Education Board, is there some geographic diversity required? And 2, is this going to be the board that specifically looks at one of the pillars when we're talking about the career ladder? Because I'm getting some good suggestions from my local superintendents on the career ladder, the type of assistance and they're looking for, and feedback from them. And I'm just trying to see how these 2 pieces come together in light of the blueprint.
So each of the counties is developing their own career ladder, and MSDE is providing some guidance and guidelines on that. But I'm not aware of the PSTEP board being part of that particular process.
Okay, so that you're saying that Professional Standards and Teachers Education isn't part of the individual career ladder development for each school system.
Right, because this is about certification and other and professional development kind of stuff. This isn't, yeah, the career ladder, they're going to each just, the career ladder, as far as I can tell, is not part of their
And
jurisdiction.
then my first question about geographic diversity on this standards and teacher education board.
That was not mentioned in the statute. No.
Okay, back to you, Stacy.
So moving on in the structure here, with under direct authority under the State Board of Education is the State Superintendent of Schools. The state superintendent has qualifications. They must be a college graduate. They have to have at least 2 years of special academic and professional graduate preparation at a college or university, and at least 7 years experience teaching and administration. So it's not a free-for-all here. You can't just choose a generic person who's led a large organization. This person has to have the experience and skills related to education and relating to teaching. I think all of this, the county superintendents and the state superintendent all are required to have some experience teaching and to have a graduate level education and experience. The state superintendent is appointed by the State Board of Education. So this is their employee. They serve a term of 4 years beginning on July 1, and their salary is set by the state board through contract. The governor has no role. The legislature has no role in the appointment of this, no formal role, I should say. Their salary comes from state general funds. They're budgeted in the department's personnel budget. And as you can see, there is the budget code for them. The role of the state superintendent is also established in state law, and you'll find that in Title II, Subtitle 3 of the education article. So if you're looking at the difference between boards and superintendent, it's like a board and a CEO. So governance, the overall structure, policy setting, overarching ideas, that's the board. When you talk about implementation and administration, this is the role of the state superintendent. So it's a big job. They have to carry out.
Stacy, let me just interrupt. I see Senator Kagan had a question. So why don't we just take Senator Kagan?
Just a super quick question, Stacy. There are no term limits for the superintendent, correct?
Well, they have a contract. So the contract is their term limit, and then they would have to be, their contract would have to be renewed, renegotiated and renewed.
But there are no limits to the number of times that could happen. So like Dr. Salmon, and she was kept on and then kept on and all that. And so,
Right. I believe Dr. Grasmick was here for over 20 years. So
exactly. And the contract, in terms of where we are right this second, Mr. Chowdhury's, Superintendent Chowdhury's contract, that would have been July 1st of this year. And is there a deadline by which that contract has to either be renewed or not?
So the July 1 date that has been referenced in the press is essentially he's 2 years into his 4-year contract. Mm-hmm. And this particular July 1 was, he would have to give notice, I think, if he wanted to leave and they had to start a new search, or the state board would have to give some indication that they didn't intend to renew his contract. So we haven't seen any of those signals as far as I've seen, and there's been no announcements made. So I think it's safe to infer that they intend to renew his contract.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
And could I just add, so he did indicate before July 1st that he wants to keep the job. And now it's up to the board. They actually met, I think, yesterday and took no action. They could have actually done that, but they have to negotiate, obviously, a contract. My understanding is that when they meet again in September, that would be the key date by which then they would have negotiated a contract. You've got to obviously agree, both parties, to the salary and all the rest, but that when they meet again in September, that's likely when they would take action formally to approve the contract and move forward. Stacy, is what I gathered from the meeting yesterday at the state board. But Senator Carrozza, you have a question?
Very briefly, this is probably directed to Senator Washington. I just, again, going over this, the detail of the role of the state superintendent. I don't see any reference to a local superintendent. So I don't know if that's just in this summary or if this is based on whatever background it's based on, but that seems to be a pretty glaring omission if we don't have even a reference to the relationship with local school superintendents.
Yeah,
So this is a summary. This is summary of statutory duties and authorities. One of the things I would say, and maybe it's a glaring error on my part when constructing this presentation, is that communication between all stakeholder groups, especially county superintendents, is an essential function of this job. It's just not listed on here, and it's not listed as a formal role, but it is an essential function. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Senator Washington.
And Senator Croza, we have seen right over the years legislation to that effect, et cetera. So I know both of your observations, one about geographic diversity in some of the boards, and second, that the importance of that there's clear lines of communications and that there be some legislative intent codified or regulation that is our intent that there is communication. So I hear that.
Well, I'll just note that as we saw on the slide that had the whole matrix or the hierarchy, however you want to reference it, they're not direct authority. It's not like the local superintendents are under the authority of the state superintendent. They each have their role in the system and they work together. And locals, obviously, their role is to take within their local control and their authority within their county school system under, in accordance with the state rules, state policies, and state law. That's what they have to work with. So obviously, if they have certain standards that are adopted by the state board, then the locals will have to adopt curriculum that teaches to those standards. The state department, the state superintendent, they'll be giving assistance and technical assistance and resources and all of those things. So it's an interconnected system, but it's not a direct line of authority. But as I said, it might be my glaring error to not include that, but essentially communication is an essential function.
Right. No, I agree. And just again, that we're very, in Maryland, of course, we value local authority very much. We also value having statewide standards. And then, local boards are not employees, as we said, of the state government in this context. Some are compensated, some are not. So we have a lot of variability among local boards. So again, as we see opportunities to clarify or to by letter or whatever about our intent around that there's communication, not approval, right? But communication, I think is a worthy effort. So we can look into it.
Okay, Stacy, back to you.
So by state law, the state superintendent is the secretary and treasurer of the state board. So they attend all of the meetings and they help set the agenda. They perform, essentially they're CEOs of the entire of the department. They make operational improvements, resource management. They set organizational culture. It comes from the top. They also set the qualifications for the professional staff. Within there, they get to make decisions about how the office is organized. And just after these slides, we'll take a look at the organization of MSDE, because our current superintendent, Chaudhary, he has made some organizational changes. And so we'll take a look at where those things fall. So the state superintendent has some other authority. Locals are the ones that decide whether they're going to sell property, whether they're going to buy property, whether they're going to construct buildings. But the state superintendent has the role of approving or disapproving these proposals. So the locals can look at it, but they have to bring that to the superintendent to make final approval or disapproval. They're charged with certifying the professional personnel in the public schools, subject to obviously the bylaws, rules and regulations of the state board and PSTEB. So in this case, our statute says certification. But again, we're defining that now as a credential, and they're moving now towards licensure, even though neither of those has any particular legal significance one way or the other. They also improve the instructional programs at specified state institutions, for example, educator prep programs at institutions of higher education. This would be the state superintendent, and they can take a look at those and they give their final approval. And also by law, they provide instructional and other resources to any school, institution, or organization under the supervision of the state board. And as we said, they also are essential communicators. They're charged with advocating for public schools across the state, communicating with all of the stakeholders about education. And that includes parents, that includes advocacy organizations, includes local boards and governments, and the legislature, one of the most essential. Any other questions?
I just
Senator Washington,
yeah, just to go back to the slide, with the approval of grounds and the interaction, you're saying that the IAC is now going to be a separate agency. Is there a interaction, again, just from not informally, but just in code or in regulation?
Yeah, so the superintendent sits on the IAC. They're a member of the IAC.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, no further questions. Stacy?
So the State Department of Education is essentially the organization that carries out all of the policies that are established by the state board. They are the infrastructure, technical support, they are the experts, they are the pass-through for grants. So they work under the direction of the state board and the state superintendent. They also direct the state's vocational and rehabilitation programs. They distribute and account for federal and state grants to local school systems and other educational institutions, and they are considered a principal department of state government for purposes of the law. This means that the state superintendent sits in the governor's council.
Sorry, hold on. I'm trying to find the raise hand.
Okay,
No, go
Senator
ahead.
Kagan.
The article in the Post the other day talked about how Maryland for the first time had to return a ton of federal funds because we were not in compliance in a timely manner with using it. Can you, Stacy, just talk about oversight and accountability on issues like federal funding?
Well, when Maryland qualifies for a grant, obviously it has to comply with whatever rules or requirements that the federal government attaches to that money. In this particular case, I think the question was the department has had a high vacancy rate, and there have been some concerns that with this high vacancy rate that some things have not been, the oversight has not been as clear as it needs to be. So I don't have a specific, I can't comment on the specific issue about the particular grant funds for this, but I did also read the same articles with you as you have, and the state superintendent said there was some oversights when he acquired the department, and that's what he's trying to work out by reorganizing the department and making sure more accountability systems are in place.
Quick follow-up though, within a department, there can be a little bit of fox guarding the hen house here. OLA, Office of Legislative Audits, who can the legislature rely on to make sure that we're using hard-fought and competitive federal funds for the benefit of our kids and our schools?
Well, I mean, those accountability systems are in place. The OLA, they do audit the department, and they do, as you know, you've sat on that committee and you get the report. So they have to come and they have to justify where they are. Obviously, the media, obviously the OIG, if, for example, this was a consistent issue, they could step in and take a look and find out where those lapses in the system are. But it's ultimately probably the state superintendent's responsibility to oversee and the state board. I mean, they are the head of the department. So if they are consistently finding that this types of money is having to be returned, or it's being misused or mishandled, then it would be the state board's responsibility to follow up and make sure, and the legislature plays an oversight role as well. If you find these things are consistent, or even you want to hear from this agency that receives all the state money, then they can be called to an account for that.
Thank you.
Okay, Senator Hester.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank the Vice Chair for a very good question. I think that there's an interesting question here about the audit reports in general and who follows up. I've looked at it from a different angle, from the cybersecurity and PII findings angle. And where I got to with that was that there actually is a small branch within the administrative, a small agency within the administrative branch that is in charge of trying to help all of the agencies make sure that the OLA audit findings are resolved. And I think that they might need more staff. And so I don't know if anybody can help me track down, I'm kind of curious which department that is, but that's something that I've been thinking about all summer.
Okay, well, that's a good issue has come up here in the last couple of questions. So again, we're doing this in July. There's some things we can do between July and when we have some ability to do something concrete. I think it's a good time, to be getting all these issues out on the table. So Stacy, why don't you? I see you're taking copious notes. That's good. Okay, back to you.
Okay, so the state superintendent has made some organizational changes since he's been there. He's indicated this was something of interest to him when he first got here. And so this is what it looks like. The state board at the top, underneath that, the office of the state superintendent. And we say it's listed as the office of the state superintendent because there's multiple divisions and offices under that direct line of authority. And under that, they put in 3 different types of structures here: the Office of Organizational Effectiveness, Office of Teaching and Learning, and Office of Operations. And this will become clear in just a minute when the next slides will show what is housed under that. As you can see, the authority here is broad. There's a lot of things that happen within the department. So in the Office of the State Superintendent alone, these are the different divisions and offices. So there's assessment, accountability, and performance reporting. This is related to student MCAPs, the Maryland Comprehensive Assessment Program, student tests. And then there's the Division of Educator Certification and Program Approval. This is teacher licensing. This is others, educator personnel, program approval. Would also be for educator prep programs and the like. Division of Financial Planning, Operations and Strategies, I think and audits are both fairly clear. Office of Communications and Community Engagement. I think one of the hallmarks of this particular superintendent is he's been very engaged in stakeholder engagements in development, for example, in development of their strategic plan that has been recently released. They've held roundtables. They go throughout the state to talk to multiple different stakeholders and communications to make sure lots of voices are heard so they can get as much information as possible. Office of Government Affairs, Education Policy and External Relations. Again, that's legislative liaison and things. Policy analysis and fiscal compliance, and research planning and program evaluation. So these are the things under the Office of the State Superintendent. The next slide is the offices and divisions under the various other branches in the department. So as you can see overall, again, they have very broad authority, and there's lots of things that they do here in the department other than just set standards here. The Office of Deputy for Organizational Effectiveness, rehabilitative services is a big part of their briefing program. Student support, academic enrichment, and educational policy. Nutrition programs. I mean, there's a lot that goes into school nutrition and community programs. There's federal law, there's federal money, there's compliance efforts. So there's lots of communication between that and locals in these particular offices. Another big part of this, the brief of the department, is this Office for the Deputy for Teaching and Learning, where a lot of our very important early childhood is housed. Infants and toddlers programs, childcare, special education services, student athletics within the public secondary schools athletic associations. And we saw last session how important that is to a lot of people. College and career pathways, that is the new blueprint, and it is they are working very hard at this point to set up these new pathways, which are scheduled to begin very shortly. Teaching and learning instructional programs and services, school improvement and supports. So, and as you can see, the Office of the Deputy of Operations is a lot of organizational and important things: equity assurance, facilities, human resources, information technology, procurement, transportation, which is also another massive part of what they do, and school facilities. So, I mean, just this is supposed to give you a wide view of all of the things that the MSDE must do just to get schools operational and to support all of our schools and making sure students can learn.
Okay, Senator Carrozza, you've got a question?
Thank you. And thank you, Stacy, for charting out the organizational structure, because I think that does prompt some questions as far as the earlier slide, you mentioned that there were 3 new offices established, Office of Organizational Effectiveness, Teaching and Learning, and I think the third one, Operations. So I just want to make sure I understood that those were 3 new offices that are in addition to this slide that you've laid out. And
so he reorganized. It's not, I don't think it's new per se, but it's newly reorganized. He has taken whatever the operations were in the department and structured them to what he thought was appropriate groupings.
okay, well, I guess my question is, and it might be more directed to Senator Washington on the follow-up that she's talking about, is this is quite the organizational structure with the different offices, and then and I certainly understand when a new leader comes in, then you kind of reorganize it, hopefully based on the fact that we're moving forward with the blueprint implementation. It probably, I didn't know if the superintendent in his updates to the committee chair had flushed out how how the organizational structure supports the blueprint implementation.
Well, I'll just say I did talk to him recently, and I didn't gather from. I think he describes what he found as kind of a messed up organizational structure, and that he's been working, spending a lot of time on, again, making the organization more efficient, more in line with what we're trying to achieve with Blueprint. I think at some point we could probably do another briefing, just bring him in potentially, ask some other follow-up questions. I don't want to speak for him, candidly, as to his rationale. He can do that for himself, especially if after September he's renewed for 4 years. He's going to be the superintendent potentially for another 4 years. We won't know that until the board acts. But once they do that, then I would probably suggest in the fall, after that September meeting, that some of these questions we could defer to actually ask him directly. So.
Chairman, so I wanted to ask Stacy, were any committees or offices removed or eliminated or consolidated into new offices or divisions? And if that might be something we could look into and get a matrix of what was and then what got consolidated.
I can get back to you with that information.
Okay. And then I guess the other one is that in some of these, I think there was a brief mention of vacancies, but I know that specifically the Office of Leadership Development and School Improvement has lost over half of its staff. And then there's the Office of College and Career Pathways, which is so very key to all of the goals that we have as the state, has lost multiple directors, a coordinator, and some key specialists. And then the division, which is one of our pillars, the Division of Early Intervention and Special Education Services and the Division of Early Childhood have lost their assistant superintendents. And then there's like 6 or 7 vacancies that are online that don't seem to be listed as open positions. That would be assistant superintendent of early intervention, chief of staff, director of community schools, leadership development. There's a number. So I guess I wanted the committee to know about that, and those listening, that there's this organizational structure, but there are also all of these vacancies. So I'm wondering if these vacancies are a function of some consolidation within divisions, or are they simply vacant positions that haven't been filled? So that might be a follow-up question, Mr. Chair, that we have.
Yeah, I'd add because the topic of special ed came up a lot last session, and that's another area where there's a deputy secretary for special ed that has been unfilled, I think, since last December. And so that for the special ed community in particular is a hot topic. So, okay, let's just keep moving on. Stacy, back to you.
So we're going back to the chart because we're leaving the state structure, but as we talked about, the one in direct line and authority, and moving on to the locals. And that's on your right side of that chart there. So as you can see, there's county governments are listed here. These are not units of county government. As we said, they're considered their own independent entities or in state law here, but county governments do have a role in that they provide a lot of money to our schools. So we'll start with the county boards of education. These are also creatures of state law, as you can see under Title IV, Subtitle 1. There's 23 counties in Baltimore City, which is treated as a county for purposes of this law. As I said, they're independent governmental units, and they sit neither comfortably within the state or comfortably within a county. 20 counties have all elected boards of education. 4 counties have combined elected and appointed boards. 22 of our counties have student members, and 8 allow those student members to vote. Most of them allow student members to attend, but then they basically looking at their thoughts and opinions about issues important to students, but they don't have voting authority. The important thing to note about funding for county boards of education and county school systems in general is that they're a combination of funds. State and county funds make up the vast majority of those funds. And then there's federal funds that come in, for example, for grants, for special education and other such issues. What do county boards do? They have a role similar to the State Board of Education, state superintendent type county boards. They're governance of educational and matters and policymaking within the county, and they oversee the day-to-day operations of public schools. So as we know, in Maryland, local control is a hallmark of our system that allows, basically, if they're complying with the state policies and state law, then they have decisional authority to make decisions about how they operate their schools. Where they are, Maryland, as we know, in terms of budget, is done by formula in state law. So there's a state portion and there's a local portion. So in order to get their local portion, they have to submit a budget to the local or county governing body, and they have to describe the revenues and expenditures by major category, and then they have to present that to the county government bodies to get the amount of money that they need to function. It is county boards of education that decide to add or subtract public schools in the county. They determine the geographical attendance areas and redistricting. And, this is a very important function and requires a lot of stakeholder engagement. In Maryland, the state board sets what students need to know, the standards, and the county boards they adopt the curriculum and the courses of study. Obviously, that is subject to state law and regulation and their policies and guidelines, but they can choose how they want that information to be conveyed to their students. Property, real property, school buildings, grounds, all of that. Construction decisions and priorities, those are made at the county level. And then they're presented to, for example, the Interagency Commission on School Construction and the state for approval of those decisions. They do transportation, a very important function, hiring school bus drivers, making sure that there's special education students, all of those things that go into making sure students get where they need to be. They hire teachers and other school personnel. They contract for the school health services and school nutrition. One important function of the county board is their appointment of the county superintendent of schools. And another important function is the adoption of the school calendar, including the starting and ending dates.
Okay, Senator Carrozza, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to ask, and maybe Senator Washington or Stacy would know, in the actual language of the law and regulations, is there anything about the relationship with the local superintendent other than the appointment that you noted? And is there anything in writing with regulations or law with the County Board of Education and the relationship with parents?
Oh, the county superintendent is the sole employee of the County Board of Education. They choose and they hire this person subject to whatever the qualifications are in state law. And then they negotiate the contract, and that's the relationship here is employer.
No, I understand the appointment process, but I didn't know if there, again, I was trying to be specific, anything in law or regs and writing that other than the appointment that, states anything about the relationship between the County Board of Education and the superintendent, and if there was anything at all, any reference to parents at all in relationship with the County Board of Education.
There's nothing in law or regulation. I mean, Senator Watson was on a County Board of Education. He might have a different perspective on that relationship if he's willing to talk.
We're not going to put Senator Watson on the spot too much unless he volunteers. Okay, any other questions before we move on, I guess, to the next slide? Okay, Stacy, back to you.
So then we move on to the county superintendent of schools. As we said, they are appointed by the county board, and this is their sole employee. They also serve a term of 4 years beginning on July 1, and their salary is set by the county board through negotiated contract. Their qualifications are similar to the state superintendent in that they have to be a college graduate. They have to have at least 2 years of graduate work at a university, but that has to include public school administration, supervision, and methods of teaching. The appointment of a county superintendent must be approved in writing by the state superintendent. That is also a state law. It can also be removed by the state superintendent or the county board for specified causes listed in the law. The term or the title county superintendent is a defined term in state law, except in Baltimore City, where the title is chief executive officer. It was also similarly in Prince George's County, but they passed a law last year to change it back to county superintendent of schools. The roles, responsibilities, and whatnot of county superintendents is also set forth in state law. That's in Title 4, Subtitle 2 of the Education article.
Hey, Stacy, I do have a quick question. This interplay between the term of 4 years, a 4-year term, and this would be true of the state's superintendent, and the contract term. Okay, just so we're clear, I mean, the boards, and this would be true at the county level or even at the state level, the boards can have a contract that's less than the 4-year term. In other words, when they, just so there's some clarity here, when they approve him, or let's say they vote in September to renew our current state superintendent, it's for a 4-year term, or can it be for a shorter period, or can they enter into a contract that's only 2 of the 4 years Just so there's a little gray zone there on that front.
So by law, it is a 4-year term.
Okay.
They may not serve the 4 years, but.
Well, I get
by law,
that, but
it's-
the contract itself doesn't have to be for 4 years, right? It could be.
Well, it doesn't say in
Right.
law what the contract has to be, but it does say in law 4-year terms.
Gotcha. Okay. So when they vote, they're going to be voting whether to keep him for 4 years, and then the contract process will be a separate negotiation and all that. Okay. Sounds good. Thanks. Okay, let's go.
So looking at what does the county superintendent do? Again, they carry out the educational policies of the state and the county board through the management and the operation of the local school system. By law, they're also the executive officer, secretary, and treasurer of the county board, and as we said, the sole employee. They're responsible for hiring and personnel decisions. It hasn't been mentioned so far, but collective bargaining is a big part of their role in Maryland, and communications with board and local government. Because they receive funding from county governments, they also have, that's a stakeholder for county superintendents. They have to be engaged with their county governing body. They're the instructional and operational leader of the school system. They have a lot of experience generally in instruction, and they work to make sure that teachers get the professional development that they need, that they have the resources, that the teachers and the curriculum is being carried out. They have a role in helping to choose the curriculum and organizing that process. If you recall the committee, when Dr. Santelises from Baltimore City came in, talked about that entire process, how expensive, how time consuming it was if you do it right. And this is part of what county superintendents do. Schools are subject to not just state laws, but federal and some local laws and regulations and policies. It's part of their responsibility to make sure all of those are carried out. They help prepare the annual school budget and present it to the County Board of Education so that it can be brought to the county governments for their input and suggestions as well. Professional development for staff, in-service training, that's part of county responsibilities. And as we talked about, they prepare recommendations for the curriculum guides and make sure all the resources are there and available. Textbook acquisition, making sure schools have all the resources they need, not even technical resources, but school nutrition, making sure that the buildings are up to code, all of those things. Those are all things that the state superintendent or the county superintendent, would be involved in. And they also prepare the recommendations or priorities for the county school system when it comes to school renovations or new construction. So obviously counties have many, many priorities. They want to make sure they have, if a building needs to be replaced or if it needs renovations, they set a priority list, and obviously that has to be sent to the IAC, and then not every project gets chosen or funded. So, but that's part of a county superintendent's responsibilities. And as we say, communication not only with boards and local governments, but with parents and the state board or the state superintendent, the state board of education, and other groups that are involved, advocacy groups and students themselves. All of those are important stakeholders in the process. So before I move on to independent governing units, any more questions? Okay, so we're just going to talk about two of the independent governing units because they have some sort of decisional authority that, for example, the Office of the Inspector General would not have. So the Interagency Commission on Co-Construction, its membership includes the state superintendent, the Secretary of Planning, the Secretary of General Services, and 6 representatives of the general public. The public members are each appointed by the governor, the president of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House. The chair is jointly selected by all the appointing authorities. Their operations come from state funds, but the school construction itself of the schools and the buildings, they are funded with GO bonds and PAYGO bonds, and that's their budget code there. They are also established in state law, and that's under Section 5302 of the Education Article. As we said, they used to be housed underneath the Maryland Department of Education, but last year, the General Assembly passed legislation to make them an independent unit of state government. So as you are well aware, their purpose is to develop and approve policies, procedures, guidelines, and regulations on school construction allocations to local jurisdictions in an independent and merit-based manner. So essentially, they are the subject matter experts on the buildings. They do facilities review. They make sure all the facilities priorities and choosing projects. They make sure the projects meet the standards by law and regulation. They assist the local school system in the planning and design of their facilities. And essentially, they're a repository of the best practices and information. And so there are useful resources for schools. You can watch any of they have their meetings online, and that's all things that you can watch or participate in. And they administer several programs, Built to Learn and the public school construction program. A lot of money goes through this commission. And the last governing unit we'll talk about today is the Accountability and Implementation Board. And it's independent because it is not, it doesn't directly oversee the State Board of Education or the state superintendent. We'll talk about its purview in a second. 7 members. It has collective qualifications for demographic and geographic diversity and specified high-level knowledge and expertise. We say collective because it is a 7-member board. There are 24 different jurisdictions, and so it's very hard to get as much diversity as you would like on a board with only 7 members. It's appointed by the governor with the advice of consent of the Senate. However, the nominees are selected by a nominating committee, and they have to send up 2 nominees for each vacant seat. So the governor gets a real choice in the matter. They serve staggered 6-year terms. The board is funded through state special funds. They are established in Section 5402 of the Education Article, and there is a baseline amount about how much money that the AIB gets each year. They have their own new budget code. Their roles, responsibilities, and all that you can find that in the Education Article under Title 5, Subtitle 4. So just highlighting here. Oh, I think Senator Augustine has a question.
We've got Senator Augustine weighing in here. Senator Augustine.
Thank you, Chair Feldman. Stacy, could you just share also just the rationale for the AIB in the first place?
Sure. So apparently the AIB has not always been a thing. When the Kerwin Commission was developing its recommendations for the blueprint. At a particular time, there was some concerns that MSDE wouldn't maybe implement the blueprint in the way that the legislature intended when it adopted the recommendations. And they came to the conclusion that having an oversight board to make sure that all of the entities, all of the units of government that had some sort of role in implementing parts of the blueprint would have one unifying entity to oversee all of that. So that not just includes the State Department of Education and local education agencies, but any unit that has a responsibility. That might include an institution of higher education. It might include community colleges or the Maryland Longitudinal Data Center, any of those who have some sort of responsibility. They have one place where they can go to get interpretations of the blueprint, and they can make sure that the provisions are being carried out as the legislature intended.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Stacy, on the geographical diversity issue, I know that has come up or did come up last session. So what the makeup of the current 7-member group, do you know off the top of your head how representative they are of this? I mean, again, it's 7, so you can't really check all the boxes in a lot of ways, but Do you have, off the top of your head, know where the 7 folks come from?
If I recall, Prince George's County, Baltimore City, Montgomery County, Anne Arundel County, and maybe Baltimore County. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, any other questions on this before we move to the next slide? Okay, Senator Carrozza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We had talked about this earlier in the briefing, and I know both Chair Feldman and Senator Washington have heard of the concerns from the locals on the kind of lack of coordination between MSDE and AIB when it comes to the blueprint implementation. So I first, and I know we'll be looking at these issues, Senator Washington, but I guess I first wanted to understand in the actual law and regulations with the creation of the AIB, you have the faithfully implementing the blueprint, but was there anything about the working relationship with MSD or with the local education agencies on any more detail, or is it that general?
It's pretty general, but they do, there's, for example, if MSD is responsible for creating the expert review teams, and the AIB would be reviewing that to make sure that it is that the expert review teams are doing the things that the law would be required. So MSD has this role, and the AIB is overseeing that. Or when it came to local implementation plans, MSDE was tasked with setting up the what do you call it? I've lost the word here. The document where they would submit it, and they would all of the different components of the document, and then they worked with the AIB to make sure that the local implementation plans were meeting all of the requirements of the blueprint, and they had comments for MSD on that. So those are the types of things that the AIB is kind of supposed to be doing. The other units are implementers, and the AIB is supposed to be overseeing, but they're providing technical assistance, support, interpretation of those issues.
Right, and
there are
that
some
reason I was
tension.
trying to ask specifically because, and again, I realize it's something that we're doing this in July, we may need to clarify, but our locals have received sometimes conflicting and confusing messages from MSD and the AIB when it comes to actual blueprint implementation. So when they for one example, in my district, local school system submitted their plan back in March. The local school system assumed there would be coordination between MSD and AIB on the feedback. And what happened is that they did receive feedback, but from both entities and at different times, which caused some confusion. And while some of the guidance or feedback was similar with the two entities, just the fact that there wasn't the coordination that the locals expected at the state level did cause some frustration and confusion. So I just, again, going back to, and I understand Senator Washington's point, understanding what's actually in the law and regulations before moving forward. But that, I was just trying to get some clarity on that so we can hopefully address that issue for our locals in the future.
Well, it's each entity making interpretations of what the law is. And I think there's definitely some tension because there's overlapping responsibilities and jurisdiction. And I think that's where it comes from. If there's clarity needed, I think both the AIB and the MSD will either let us know, or you'll have to make a decision as a body, as a legislature, that clarity is needed and that you can spell that out with their input. But I think it's each agency making interpretations of the law as they see fit at this point.
Yes, Stacey, I just wanted to ask, and this is an important point around there being some overlapping duties, but from just a question from our sort of our historical statutory powers and duty. The state board has the general powers of, I guess they're called visitational powers. And
Visitorial, yeah.
Visitorial powers. And then there's their general authority to provide and supervise for public education and secondary education. So that's been the history of the broad legislative intent. Would that be correct?
That has not changed.
Right.
That is
So
what they do, and they are the body that directs and establishes education policy. The AIB is specifically focused on the blueprint and making sure the blueprint is implemented and executed according to the law. That is what their brief is supposed to be. Obviously, the blueprint is massive and it covers and touches on many, many different responsibilities of the department. So again, and this it's still fairly new. I mean, as you know, because of the blueprint being vetoed by the governor, the implementation was delayed. And so if you look at it, the AIB has only been up and running maybe for 2 years at the end. I would say that's being really generous.
At best, because we received the briefing last year, they hadn't hired anything. So it's been
right. So the next part of the briefing that talks about the blueprint update, one of the things that I would mention is that, yes, they are currently working to staff themselves up. So they're entitled to 14 different positions. I think they have about 6 full-time at this point. So they're working on it, but yes, they have discussed that there has been challenges in standing up a whole new agency at the same time that they have been charged with developing the comprehensive implementation plan and overseeing all the other responsibilities. So not to say there has been a lot of challenges, and as everyone figures out their role and they start to work out implementation decisions. Senator Watson.
Thanks, Stacy. Quick question. I never really understood how we did it all these years, but there's some kind of ranking system.
so, Senator.
Yeah, I have a bad connection, so here.
Yeah, so just that they also have the ability to withhold funds from state entities and local school systems, correct?
I think I missed the first part of that, but by law, yes, they do. There is an automatic withholding in the law of 25% of the state increase in funds. And then they get recommendations from the department and other entities to release those funds, but they can continue to withhold for failure to implement under certain circumstances. And those are all laid out in the law. There's an appeal process that must be developed by the AIB with regard to that. But this particular year, the baseline was that the locals had to submit their local implementation plans by a specific date in a timely manner to include certain information. And the AIB had determined that every local entity had done that. So everyone's getting their funds. There was no withholding this year.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I apologize. I had an unstable connection here for about a minute. Senator Watson, did you get a question? Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Thanks, Stacy, for what you're doing. I had a question. I never understood it over these many, many years, but there's some kind of way our school districts are racked and stacked against each other. And I always know who the 23rd and 24th place has always been. If the Accountability and Implementation Board is going to be responsible for the metrics going forward to achieve the goals of the blueprint, will we take a new fresh look at how our school systems are racked and stacked in terms of performance, so that when this new rating comes out, it's going to be a function of the AIB and not some archaic way of determining that?
Well, I mean, they're not exactly sure I understand what your question is in terms of, what do you mean racked and stacked?
You don't, okay. So each year, our school systems are ranked. There's a top performing school district within the state of Maryland, and historically Prince George's and Baltimore City have been ranked 23rd and 24th, right? And I never knew the sausage making of what determines the criteria for how we're ranked and stacked. And so if we're moving forward with this uber expensive blueprint, and the Accountability Implementation Board is responsible for the metrics determining success and achievement, will the AIB be responsible for ultimately establishing that criteria by which we can now say what's the best performing school district, in our state, all the way down, ranking all 24 districts?
So I think if I get this, that the AIB is actually responsible for evaluating the outcomes of the blueprint. They're not responsible for the ranking of the system. I mean, a few years ago, and it might be more than a few at this point, they put into law some performance standards for schools and school districts, and that's done by the Department of Education. That's not done through the AIB. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm not completely sure about the ranking system that you're referencing, but we can definitely get some more information about that, and I can get that back to you. I apologize for that.
All right, thank you.
Okay, any other questions before we move on here? Okay, seeing none. Stacy?
So this is the broad role of the AIB. So this is not an exhaustive list of what the AIB does, but essentially this is the goal. I mean, their largest responsibility here is development of the comprehensive implementation plan, which, as you know, was adopted on December 1st of last year. That was after there was a lot of delays. It took longer than they thought, but and the legislature passed legislation to move those dates, so they did come into compliance on December 1st. They oversee the CTE committee. They provide technical assistance to locals and any of the entities that have a responsibility for implementing the blueprint. As we said, the career ladder is the local school systems are ones developing them, and MSDE is providing some guidance and guidelines for those. However, the AIB is charged with determining that it's well established throughout the state, and that will trigger various things within the blueprint, such as when certain requirements have to be met. For example, you passed a law last year that would require curriculum to only be developed by certain people on the career ladder. Those things aren't triggered until obviously a career ladder is established throughout the state, because no one is on a career ladder. So those types of requirements as they move through. They are also charged with educating the public and stakeholders on the process. And as you know, they have made the rounds, making lots of presentations to various groups. Recently, they've made presentations to committees in the legislature, workforce development boards on the Eastern Shore, the IAC, any other group that comes and calls and has questions, that they will come and talk to them about the blueprint and its and the requirements, maybe even specific to that particular group. We talked about the withholding of the 25% increase in the state share of major funds. And these are some of the reasons why they could continue to withhold that increase of funds. And it has to be more than, or to withhold more than 25%, failing to make sufficient progress on their implementation plan, failing to take steps to improve student performance, or failing to develop or revise an implementation plan. But those are some of the reasons. And again, there's an appeals process and whatnot. As most locals have just adopted and submitted their first version of their implementation plan, there's about 3 on their steps process, then everybody is working according to plan so far. And they have to submit an annual report to the General Assembly. They have just done that, and that's available to read, and I can forward that to everybody if they want to take a look at that. One of the more, I think, provisions in the law that people have asked about are these provisions here about the the relationship between the department and the state board and the AIB. So as we see, the board is not intended to usurp or abrogate the operational authority of these various entities. The Governor's Workforce Development Board, MHEC, Department of Commerce, Labor, the day-to-day workings of the department and the state superintendent and the locals, that's all within their own jurisdiction. The AIB is not supposed to be taking over those responsibilities. It is not becoming the policy setter or the operator of schools. They do have, if you look on the right under 3I, they have the plenary authority over all matters within its jurisdiction under this subtitle, including intended outcomes for the blueprint. That is what they have authority over. And if there's a conflict between this board, the AIB, and the policy of the other entity, when it relates to the blueprint, then the AIB's decision or policy controls. That is, I think, where where most people have concerns or questions.
A question from Senator Augustine, then from Senator Watson. Okay, so Senator Augustine, you're first.
Thank you, Chair Feldman. It's just my ignorance. Can you define plenary authority for me?
So I think that just means they have very wide authority here over that. Or absolute.
Well, how does that, I'm trying to understand how that interplays with the other aspects where they do not abrogate the authority, the other areas of authority.
Well, I think, for example, if there was a division between MSD and the AIB on some aspect of, say, an expert review team, or a provision that they wanted to include in an implementation plan, and MSD took one direction and AIB took another direction. In the event that there's that conflict, then the AIB's policy on that particular matter related to the blueprint would control versus that of MSD or whatnot. Again, I think these are all going to be interpretations of each of those entities, and they will have to work them out. There's no mechanism in here. It just, this is how it was determined that the AIB would allow for its goal of implementing the blueprint with fidelity.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay,
Stacey,
Senator Watson.
yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Stacey, can you just quickly flip back to the prior slide?
Sure.
So that second to the last bullet is really disturbing to me. So what this explicitly is stating is that money is sufficient to solve all the issues with respect to our education system. And I'm just not buying it. And I will continue to say it is very challenging to try to compare an 1,800 student school board system with 130,000 that I have in Prince George's County. I want us as a committee to take a real good look at this one bullet for the potential impacts going down the road, because it literally says, if we put X amount of dollars in this and we're not seeing the intended results, then the AIB can withhold funding for future allocations. And I just have a fundamental problem with that. And I just wanted to state that for the record. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay, for the record, if there is a record, it's duly noted. And that said, Stacey, we'll go back to you.
So that's what I have on the governing units. If you have any like general questions, whoops, sorry.
Okay.
That's what I have on that. I mean, there's another presentation on the blueprint, an update on the blueprint.
Before you get started, Stacey, thank you so much. This is very illuminating. Even certainly, I'm sure for new committee members, but I know that some of us were new. We came in a little later. Senator Hester and I came in. This was all sort of already drafted and done when we came on the committee. And so it's really very, very helpful to really take a deep dive on what is actually in law and what was in the blueprint.
Amen.
Yeah, no, I echo that. So I think very thorough, Stacy, excellent job. But again, as I said at the beginning, two things. Number one, I'm glad we're doing this in July because you can see some of the issues have come up, whether, Senator Watson's point. By the way, on that 25% withholding, Stacy, a number, that's statutorily, is that statute or regulatory, or where does that authority in the?
I'm having some trouble here finding.
Oh, can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you. I'm just
I think it's in statute. Chairman.
Okay,
I'm having trouble with my screen here. Hold on a second.
Okay.
Sorry. Let's see here.
I was going to ask what happens to that money. Like if it gets withheld, does it get withheld until they do something and then they get it? Or is it like gone forever?
No, it's withheld in the sense that it's just not given. The money is already allocated. The money is just held back until it's kind of used as a leverage to get that entity that is not doing what they're supposed to be doing to do what they're supposed to do. In essence, and we're hoping that by withholding that and making them do that, then they'll end up and releasing that at some other point in time.
Okay, well, I think there's a lot of issues that popped up here during this hour and a half. And I don't want to keep people too much longer. But a couple of things leap out. Number one, back on the budget issue, which I think is huge because of the pending deficits and shortfalls. We are going to work on trying, have a separate with B&T, a separate briefing at some point focused entirely on the interplay between our structural budget deficits down the road and how that plays into I think that's an important topic. If we do get Superintendent Chaudhry back post September when he potentially has been re-upped by the state board, it might be helpful to get Chair Leggett at the same table. Some of these tensions, Chair Leggett actually, did send a letter that caused a bit of a kerfuffle, raising, I think Senator Augustine brought up this issue of plenary power. That's a legal term, and you're right, subject to interpretation. And I could sort of envision down the road other tensions, and some of this could end up in a litigation forum of what does plenary authority mean? Is it actually true that the implementation board supersedes any determination? These are the kinds of things that it would be nice to kind of get out front of early. And so I think that having both of them together side by side is something I think to think about along with the budget briefing. And these other issues that have popped up, what's in regulation versus what's in statute that obviously we can put bills in to modify and tweak. And I think last session there was a desire to not mess with the blueprint because it was still so early. But I think now we're getting to a place where if there's some policymakers on this committee that, feel that it's good to put out in play some tweaks, statutory tweaks, then I think it's fair game. And so with that said, Senator Lewis Young, you've got your hand up and I'll yield it to you. And again, we'll try to bring some closure here to today's meeting. Okay. So Karen.
Thank you. While we're developing an agenda for future meetings, something I would like to learn more about is the state funding formula. We know how our local counties fund education, but there's been a lot of questions about how the state formula works or doesn't work. For example, in Frederick County, which percentage-wise is the highest growth county in our state, there's a feeling that because the numbers are taken at a point in time, 2 years before implementation, it actually hurts us. So I'd like some elaboration on the formula so that we either better understand it or could be in a position to tweak it.
Okay, and I think Senator Carrozza has brought up the issue of the education the formulas for as it pertains to her part of the state as well. I think that again maybe could get tied back into when we talk about the budget shortfalls, where the money comes from. I think that would be ripe for being part and parcel of that next briefing. Any other outstanding issues before we sort of call it a day here? Stacy, any
Also,
parting
I had
comments
the
or-
part on the blueprint, if you want to.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Also, I should just
apologize.
note that I got a note here that on the funding withholding, that we should note that it's 25% of the increase of the state. So it's of the state funding. So it's not all of the money, it's a percentage of the state increase under the blueprint that's withheld. And to that money, if it's withheld, goes into a special fund with the comptroller. So it's not.
Okay, I didn't want to cut you off, Stacy. Was there another part of the presentation you wanted to?
Yes,
Chairman, this is a really important. Do we could get like a brief overview, but I think an opportunity to fully review.
Yeah, I apologize
the
for that.
blueprint.
Okay.
No, I'm just saying maybe
Yeah.
maybe we can attach it to a future meeting, or we do it quickly, but
Yeah, well, let's go.
and then talk about it more. But
Yeah,
this is-
yeah. Why don't we go through the slides here? I think yeah. Let's just go.
So this isn't nearly as long. It's just
Yeah.
Just because people were interested, just a brief timeline of the blueprint law when it started, the Kerwin Commission in 2016. Essentially, the law was passed in 2020, and then it was vetoed, and then the veto was overridden in 2021. And in that particular session, beyond the veto, it also passed Chapter 55, which revised various timelines in the blueprint, given the delay and impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then further legislation was passed in 2022 that also made some further revisions on timelines due to these delays. Basically, the blueprint has 5 pillars: early childhood education, high quality and diverse teachers and learners, college and career readiness, more resources for students to be successful, and governance and accountability. So those are the groupings within the recommendation.
Stacy, sorry,
Oh.
Mr. Chair, can you go back one, please? Mr.
Okay, so okay.
Stacy, I just wanted to clarify. Number 2, you said high quality and diverse teachers and learners, and it
Yeah, it
says
should be leaders.
which it is,
That's my reading versus the actual, it is leaders.
but it is leaders. Okay, so
Yes.
the question, I guess, is
Mhm.
we put a fair amount of thought when we were working on the blueprint on the diversity of students.
Mhm.
And the diverse ways of learning, including language access, including students with disabilities and all that. And is that under number 4? Where does that go? Because that's not clear to me.
We're talking about, for example, more resources for students to be successful. It includes like special education, that includes English learners, that includes community schools, those types of things, resources that get there.
Thank you, Stacy.
That is where that is housed.
I just didn't know which block that, because that's not clear enough for me. So thank you. Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Mr.
You're
Chair.
welcome. Okay. So I'm going to describe how I'm going to go forward is I'll describe what the goals are of each of the pillars and then talk about some of the updates. And again, this list, none of it's exhaustive, but it's illustrative of what's happening because there's a lot happening all at the same time here. So for pillar 1 in early childhood education, basically the goal is for all students to enter kindergarten ready to learn developmentally as well as socially and academically. There is to be a significant expansion of voluntary, high quality, full day pre-kindergarten free for all low income 3 and 4-year-old children. Right now, we're at the phase of making sure moving to all day kindergarten for 4-year-olds and phasing in 3-year-olds. It's a long process, and the learning where our obstacles and setbacks are. Capacity building for childcare providers as children move out of childcare and into pre-K. This is causing some issues for childcare providers and providing additional supports and services for young children and their families, and establishing high quality standards for pre-K teachers and their assistants. Those are the goals of Pillar 1 recommendations. So the progress that we're making right now since fall of 2016, full day pre-K for 4-year-olds has increased by over 7,000 students, or 71%, as local education agencies or county boards They make room for more children to come. This requires space considerations, capital budget allotments. It's raising issues of having access to quality and high standards for pre-K teachers. There's some concern that there's not enough programs out there, and that there needs to be an increase in the expansion of educator prep programs and practicums available. We have Judy centers. The goal was to increase 135 centers over 10 years. As of fiscal year 22, there have been 69 Judy centers throughout the state and 36 additional centers in 21 through 24. Patty centers, which were the new name for the family support centers, they deal with family and supports, not just academics. They call for an increase of 30 centers over 10 years. We have a network of 24 right now in 14 counties, and they offer free educational health-related services to parents and their children ages birth through 3. We have 9 new centers coming online in fiscal 22 through 24. Part of one of the goals is the AIB is convening a work group to determine alternative pathways for certifying high quality pre-K teachers and their assistants. There's a report due on December 1st on this particular issue, and there was funds withheld in the budget this year in order to get this goal accomplished. Under Pillar 2 on high quality and diverse teachers and leaders, Maryland, our goal here is to have high quality and diverse teachers and leaders that approximates the diversity of Maryland students statewide and by their district. Right now, we obviously do not meet this goal. The vast majority of the teachers and professionals are white, and we're looking to increase the diversity of our teacher and administrator corps in various ways. Also, it's for teachers and school leaders to be provided with professional learning opportunities to improve student outcomes. And it gives teachers and these leaders additional responsibility, authorities, and status and compensation so that we increase the status of the profession overall and encourage more people to go into these, to be teachers in Maryland. So what are we doing right now to accomplish these goals? First, MSDE has proposed new educator preparation and licensure regulations, and these include incorporating science of reading requirements for new professionals earning a license and those who already have a license to renew their license. AIB has convened a teacher preparation education work group beginning in August 2022. There have been concerns about the blueprint requirement of adding a equivalent to a full year of a teacher residency and practicum requirement. So this is a multi-stakeholder work group with IHEs and teachers and other advocates, stakeholders in this work group discussing those issues as we work to change or align teacher preparation curriculum with the standards of the blueprint. So in between fiscal years 20 and 24, there's a 10% talent. The blueprint requires a 10% teacher salary increase in all jurisdictions. The 3% state share of that 10% was provided in fiscal 20, and additional funds will be provided in fiscal years 22 through 24. Each of the local jurisdictions has begun their development of their career ladder, and MSDE is working on guidance and technical support for that. In fiscal 23, the bonus incentive to teachers of $10,000 if they earn a national board certification. Teachers can also earn an additional salary bonus of $7,000 for teachers who teach in low performing schools who hold a national board certification. So this is continuing. This is not just a one-time bonus, but it's basically a salary increase. The Maryland Longitudinal Data Center has submitted a report to the AIB on its progress in increasing preparation and diversity of teacher candidates and new teachers in the state. That was submitted in July 2022. All of the reports that are required to go to the AIB are on the AIB's website. They have a section on reports that are submitted. There is a ton of information there if people want to take a look. For example, local implementation plans that have been submitted, the AIB's master comprehensive implementation plan, all of that. Any reports that have submitted, teacher diversity, pre-K, all available on their website. The third pillar of the blueprint is college and career readiness. The goal here of the blueprint was to have an empirically based college and career readiness standard that reflects readiness for post-secondary education and training. So that's education and workforce. The education system designed to ensure all students who enter school are ready to learn and reach the standard by the CCR standard by 10th grade or on track for that and ready to graduate high school. And then any student who reaches the CCR standard before high school graduation can move on to a choice of high quality post-CCR pathways that prepare students for college. They offer credit in high school for dual enrollment, or they provide high quality career and technical education training or apprenticeship opportunities. The goal being, if students are not in the college prep, then about 45% earn some sort of credential or participate in an apprenticeship. So where are we on some of these goals? So at the board meeting yesterday, MSD presented to the state board the interim findings.
Hey, Stacy, can I just interrupt real quick? Senator Kagan weighed in. She might have been on the pillar 2 part. So why don't we, we're on pillar 3. Okay.
No. Pillar 2. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, Stacy. You were talking about the MLDS report on the progress of diversifying our teacher candidate. I don't recall, and the slide isn't clear as to who's responsible and who's doing the what the plan is for trying to diversify. We can't just say we want more diverse teachers. And again, that is by gender, which is important, race, ethnicity. I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but language facility, language skills and knowledge and all that. Who's responsible? Because MLDS is writing the report. And the IAB can't do it. Is that MSDE? Is it the 24 locals? Is it all?
It's a shared responsibility. For example, institutions of higher education with teacher prep programs, they have responsibilities in this area. Under the Educator Shortage Reduction Act that was passed last year, they will have to set some goals, and then they have to report back to MSDE on their progress in making those goals. MSDE is also has some responsibilities in this area, and each of the locals also has responsibilities in this area. So they have to submit reports on the diversity of their personnel, teacher personnel, and other personnel, and the methods that they're using to recruit additional teachers with diversity in mind. So those reports are also all on the AIB's website. Every jurisdiction has submitted one to the AIB as well. So it's a shared responsibility. And I think what they're looking to get is to have other people share innovative ways or ways, efficient and effective ways to get more teachers that look like our students in schools into schools. So, or attract them to the profession overall.
100%. Mr. Chair, I just want to, so everything Stacy said is spot on and makes sense and all that. The piece that doesn't seem to be as clear is how do we reach the teacher candidates or graduates who are coming from Wyoming or Connecticut or something. So in-state is one thing, and for our higher education institutions is one thing. But the question is, how are we reaching folks in other states? And is that the county's responsibility, the state, the partnership? And again, if these reports are going to MSDE, does MLDS have access to all of the data and the insights on the progress we're actually making? That there just seem to be a lot of players in this, and I worry that we may fall short and that it's a heavy lift, and it's critically important.
Okay, well, again, a lot of people are bringing up a lot of good issues here, and that's why we're doing this. So why don't we go back to pillar 3, and then let's try to sort of move forward. But excellent point, Senator Kagan.
So that, as I said, that MSD just reported to the state board its findings, the interim findings of this empirical study or the qualitative study on an interim CCR standard. The final report's due in August to September of this year. Basically, the findings are that one measure being a score on the MCAPS is probably insufficient and not capturing all the students who actually qualify. So it's been an interesting report. That's also on MSDE's website if you're interested in taking a look at that. So there's 3 post CCR pathways detailed in the blueprint: advanced placement or IB programs, dual enrollment or early college programs. Early college is when students go to a program where they take some high school courses and they progressively start taking more higher level courses at the same time, and then they graduate with both an associate's degree and a high school diploma, or CTE programs. So MSD right now is doing some great work on engaging local school systems, IHEs, on best practices and research on developing what these pathways are going to look like and aligning the curriculum with or the standards in curriculum and how this is all going to have to work. There's continued implementation by the locals of the 9th grade tracker system, concurrent with MSD also developing what's being called an early warning indicator system that tracks students' progression through key milestones. Basically, they want to capture students on various important key milestones in the student's career from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, to capture those students who were losing before, so that they can stay on track and graduate. Some of those key points aren't just necessarily academic, but other things such as absenteeism or contact with disciplinary systems. So those will go into some sort of system so teachers or administrators can find these students and get to them early. And also another important development is one of the requirements of the blueprint is career counseling for middle and high school students. And so there's each of the locals or the counties is establishing MOUs or memorandums of understanding with workforce development boards or county governments to provide this at earlier points in time.
Hey, Senator Carrozza.
I'll be very brief, just to flag that in each one of the pillars, some of us are receiving, the feedback from local superintendents on not just the budget challenges, but other issues, so that, when we talk about our follow-up briefings. Also, and I know if Senator Augustine is still on the Zoom, we also, when we're talking about this pillar, college and career readiness, we have the 2030 Apprenticeship Commission that somehow we would want to fold the work that we're doing there into this work. And I'll defer to Senator Augustine on that, but I just wanted to kind of flag that for our committee, since a couple of our members are on that commission.
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up, Senator Carrozza. Okay, Senator Lewis Young, and then let's go. After Senator Lewis Young, we're gonna try to get to pillar 4, and then Senator Hester as well. Okay, so Senator Lewis Young, you're next.
Thank you very much. At the time most of these pillars were developed, we were not aware of the extent of how COVID would affect learning, and in particular, some of the goals as expressed in these pillars, particularly pillar 3. Is there any information that you can provide us, or any special effort that looks at that and perhaps makes some course corrections to address the COVID effect on our goals?
Well, part of that, I'm glad you brought this up. I mean, it's not included on this particular slide, but the AIB does highlight this in their annual report on the importance of the transitional supplemental instruction for struggling learners. There was a lot of federal money that flowed into the state to begin remediating the effects of learning loss post-COVID. And so this program was started in fiscal year 20 to provide funding to school systems, to provide tutoring and supplemental instructions to students in K through 3 who are not reading on grade level, and not only reading, but for math. So there is money, and there have been devoted resources and to providing supplemental tutoring to students to get them back up to where they need to be. So I mean, yes, COVID is still, casting a shadow over everything here, and it's taken into consideration. So there is money in there. There are programs out there, and they're working on those things. Obviously, as issues arise, the AIB and locals will flag that for both MSDE. I apologize, that is the grandfather clock going off in the background. So they're flagging these issues, and if they don't meet timelines, they'll have to work through those issues.
Thank you.
Okay, Senator Hester, you're going to get the last word on this, and then we'll move to Pillar 4 and try to get.
I'll be really quick, and Stacy, you could answer offline. My question is, as we move forward with the support for the career counseling, how do we know what they will be counseling on? Like, does it include apprenticeships? Does it include, different types of tracks? So if you could just let me know, like, kind of who I would talk to get that question answered, that would be awesome.
Okay, I will track it down to who to talk to about that. But yes, it will also be talking about career pathways, and apprenticeships are obviously a big part of that, and a very important issue, and one that is very important to all of our members. So,
and the new program, the 1-year apprenticeship opportunity paid internship that we passed last year.
Okay, we being the EEE Committee.
Indeed.
Okay.
I'm not saying it very well. The service, the 1-year service program.
Yes.
Paid that. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so let's Stacey, why don't we move to the next pillar and then see where we are here. Okay.
So I mean, this is an important goal, more resources for students to be successful. A lot of this involves the new funding programs under the formula funding, for example. But basically, our goal here is for students who come from difficult circumstances, low-income households, schools with high concentrations from low-income households, English learners, special education services, homeless youth, all of those students, to get them additional resources so that they can succeed in school and beyond, and that they can meet the CCR standard at the same rate of other students. So there's a lot of important work being done in this, under this pillar, and basically also getting students the behavioral health services they need. Part of that here is the concentration of poverty grant to support community schools. This includes direct funding for to support a community school coordinator. The number of students who, as the AIB has pointed out, there's a lot of inputs coming in here, not as many outputs yet because the blueprint is still new. So these are things that are happening, but we don't see a lot of, we don't have metrics to measure them by quite yet. But some of the good things, for example, are the number of schools receiving these grants has increased from 202 in fiscal 20 to 358 in 24. The only two counties that don't have, I guess, schools that have gotten some of these are Calvert and Queen Anne's. As the chair mentioned earlier, under the AIB's comprehensive implementation plan, there's preparations for the convening of a work group on instruction and services for students with disabilities, a special education work group. Basically, I think some of the advocates for students with disabilities is concerned that there's not a lot of specifically mentioned in the blueprint for students who receive special education services. And this is part of the answer of that is to start to convene this work group to start making recommendations. Further not listed on this slide includes continued work by MSDE on the Neighborhood Indicators of Poverty report. They had a report come out last year. There was legislation introduced, but it was determined it's probably just not ready yet. And work continues on that very important indicator. And lastly, governance and accountability makes up Pillar 5. Partly this is the blueprint being fully implemented with fidelity and success, and that regardless of where they live, household income, race, ethnicity, gender, language spoken at home, disabilities, and all those characteristics, that they leave high school ready to succeed, however they choose, whether it's be academically or in training and work. What's going on here is the comprehensive implementation plan was adopted December 1, as I previously mentioned. There was some concern that there wasn't a lot of metrics in the initial report. And so the AIB has convened an outcome measures work group that continues its work and meets quite frequently. And the results of that will start being implemented or adopted within the comprehensive plan. I think Rachel had mentioned that they can start adding those in either August of this year. And then their submission, all of the local school systems had submitted their initial implementation plan by the March 15th deadline. AIB and MSDE continue to review those and make recommendations on improving those reports. There have been developments and implementation of the expert review team deployments. There was some work on this last year where they went into a few schools as a beta measure, but this year they go into full force. And so there have been a lot of interest, and MSD made great strides. Last I had read, they had hired over 120 people, and I'm sure there's going to be more to deploy these various teams to go into each school based on conditions set forth in statute to determine how schools are functioning, whether these are low performing schools or whether these are high performing schools, and to be able to improve each of those schools or share the effective strategies that work. Further, because of concerns about geographical and other diversity lacking on the AIB appointed 4 advisory committees corresponding to pillars 1 through 4 to provide insights, ideas, and feedback. Basically, these are very diverse groups of stakeholders from across the strait, reflecting the geographic, racial, ethnic, cultural, economic, and gender diversity. So they had set up a process. I cannot remember how many are on each committee at this moment, but they've been pretty successful. I think the AIB has been really pleased with the suggestions and information that have been provided by these. So that's what I have today. Again, this is not comprehensive by any stretch. It's just to give you an idea of how things are progressing. There's a lot going on.
Well, it was comprehensive enough. I mean, I will say I thought it was outstanding. So I guess a couple just quick thoughts. First of all, Stacey, did you send these PowerPoints? It'd be nice. I think that every member of the committee would like
right after it's over. Yes, sure.
Yeah, I think everybody'd like to have this in hand. That'd be number one. Obviously, hugely important topic. I think spending 10 to 12 o'clock, 10 a.m. to 12 noon today was worth it. But there's more here. Thus, I think we're going to have to be continued, whether it's the joint budget discussion with the B&T folks or some other briefings with Chair Leggett, Superintendent, et cetera. I think that's to be determined how we structure that. Senator Lewison, you have your hand up? No? Okay, mistake?
Good job.
Okay. And I think with that, any other final comments, Stacey, or any what do they say, the good of the order? Anybody else want to weigh in before we adjourn here? Yes, Vice Chair Kagan.
I just want to thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all. I thought this was super valuable. And Stacey, thank you for all your work. And I think it was Senator Washington who suggested it and pushed for it. And so I just want to give her a special shout out. Thank you for what you do and stuff on education policy too. So I found this terrific. And I'm sorry that I had another meeting that I couldn't change and that I was late for the beginning. But
okay, well, again, if anybody missed it that and they want to listen to the 2 hours we just spent together. It has been recorded and it will be live on the General Assembly website. So, okay, folks, I think this was great, and I'm going to bid everybody adieu and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and to be continued. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.